Hi, everyone. My name is Annie Rogers, and on behalf of the ADDitude team, I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's ADHD Experts presentation titled RSD Toolkit, Strategies for Managing Your Sensitivities in Real Time. Leading today's presentation is a dear friend and longtime contributor to ADDitude, Dr. Sharon Saline. Sharon is a clinical psychologist, consultant, international speaker, and award-winning author. She specializes in working with children, teens, emerging adults, and families living with ADHD, anxiety, learning disabilities, autism, twice exceptionality, and mental health issues in general. Her unique perspective as a sibling in an ADHD home and decades of experience assist her in guiding families and adults toward effective communication and closer connections. Now, though it's not included in the DSM, emotional dysregulation is increasingly seen as a core component of ADHD. Specifically, many individuals with ADHD report experiencing rejection-sensitive dysphoria, which is like a stark emotional pain and disproportionate response to real or perceived criticism. People with RSD fear that they will lose others' love, support, and respect, and that fear can lead to extreme mood shifts and feelings of unbearable pain. In today's webinar, we will explore practical tools to help manage these intense emotions. We'd like to actually begin today's webinar by asking a quick poll question to our live audience. Based on your experience or that of your family, do you believe that RSD should be included in the diagnostic criteria for ADHD in children and in adults? Please select your answers, and you can comment in the text box under the video player to tell us more. In the meantime, for answers to common questions about our webinars, slides, transcripts, certificates of attendance, just click on the FAQ tab of your webinar screen. If you're listening in replay or podcast mode, go to ADDitudemag.com and search podcast 476 to access all the resources for today's webinar. You can also click on the episode description wherever you stream your podcasts. If you support the work we're doing at ADDitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit ADDitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for ADDitude Magazine. If you do it now, you will receive our very special 25th anniversary issue, which features Dr. Saline among other ADHD luminaries. Click the magazine tab on the screen to learn more. Okay, last thing, the sponsor of today's webinar is Inflow. Inflow is the #1 app to help you manage your ADHD. Developed by leading clinicians, Inflow is a science-based self-help program based on the principles of cognitive behavioral therapy. Join Inflow today to better understand and manage your ADHD. Click on the link on your screen to learn more. ADDitude thanks our sponsors for supporting our free webinars. Sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. Okay, with all that out of the way, I'm so pleased to welcome you, Dr. Sharon Saline. Thank you so much for joining us today and for leading this discussion on RSD.
Thank you, Annie, for that lovely introduction. I'm thrilled to be here to talk about such an important topic. I would like to just give myself a disclaimer before we start, or maybe it's a funny story. I don't generally have problems creating presentations. I have ideas, I'm curious about things, I like the creative aspect of matching text with photos. But boy, did I struggle with this presentation. My perfectionism was out in its full regalia. My own rejection sensitivities, like, would I do a good enough job? And what if people didn't like it? And then they would sort of just not want to listen or follow me anymore. That was out there. And of course, a desire to do a really good job, make it just right for all of you. So I was working till the very 11th hour on it. And I have to say that I thought it was just kind of amusing that here we are talking about, social anxiety and rejection sensitive dysphoria and perfectionism and imposter syndrome, which are all sort of circling in the same pool. And I myself was experiencing these as I was preparing to be here today. So let's start with my first question. Does this sound familiar to you? Evan, age 25, says, what I mean by anxious is I have fears of bad things happening or not working out. I just feel like I have this weight on my chest a lot of the time. This makes me nervous, I guess. Kyla, age 19, says, I'm scared of what other kids will think about me. Sometimes I don't really know what to say. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I look stupid? Maybe they don't like me. And I don't know if I can take that. When someone gives me feedback at work, I expect it to be bad, says Julia, age 43. It's been that way so much in the past. Why would this time be any different? Sometimes it's all right. But if it's not, it feels like a punch in my stomach. It hurts so much. George, age 29, shares, honestly, it's so exhausting trying to figure out things all day. What people are saying, what I should say or do. I need a manual. I never get it right. And Rex, age 46, shared with me recently, when I get upset, it's like a huge wave, a tidal wave. I'm doing fine, and then pow, suddenly I'm struggling to keep my head above water. I just have these huge reactions to things that I can't seem to control. When we talk about RSD, we need to talk about anxiety and mood disorders. So I'd like to zoom out a bit and remember that ADHD rarely travels alone. Coexisting conditions are very common and worth noting before we kind of roll up our sleeves in a few slides to dig into RSD. We know that anxiety disorders are problems related to fears and worries. Anxiety disorders differ based on the focus of a person's worry. Anxiety is all about safety and security. It wants to make uncomfortable feelings go away immediately. Anxious adults and kids actually have lower self-confidence. Adults tend to have more professional or peer difficulties. There can be family conflict. And we know that anxiety is not something that we can get rid of. It's a natural human response that comes from serving a purpose. So we want to learn how to respond to it in ways that are healthy and manageable. Untreated anxiety leads to depression. And roughly 1/5 to 1/2 of adults with ADHD have a major depressive disorder, or what we call dysthymia, which is a low-level persistent depression. As you can see on the slide, 50% of adults with ADHD have an anxiety diagnosis. And the rates of bipolar disorder and ADHD are high as well, 20%. What happens to the ADHD brain under stress and anxiety? Well, the stress of big feelings negatively affects our overtaxed executive functioning skills. So people who have ADHD, whether it's relatively mild or more severe, feel this sense that when they're stressed, their weakest executive functioning skills are hit first and hardest. Plus, there's an over-identification with I feel, whatever the feeling is, that makes it tough to witness our feelings and step back from them and see them more neutrally, because the feeling is who I am. It's not something I'm experiencing. There's flooding by intense feelings that can be positive or negative, which overwhelms capacity to think about what's going on, engage the consequences of our choices and behaviors. Weaker working memory has been found to reduce coping strategies because it's harder to manage and respond to the intense rush of emotions. You can't retrieve past successes and apply them to the present as readily as people who do not have working memory challenges. Many adults with ADHD who don't meet the diagnostic criteria for anxiety might still experience intense situational or general anxiety due to issues with time, emotional dysregulation, procrastination, and the possibility of a social stigma. Annie mentioned emotional dysregulation earlier, and this is something that occurs for people who have ADHD, but also are neurodivergent, who might have level 1 autism, a learning disability, or be twice exceptional. The brain can't effectively regulate sensory signals. Maybe things are too loud, too intense, too much, that overwhelm. And this is true for feelings as well. And so there's that sense of that tidal wave, like I'm drowning a bit, or a sense of physical pain. It hurts me so much emotionally that it hurts me physically. In terms of rejection sensitive dysphoria, it's a response of our autonomic nervous system that is overreacting to a perceived danger. So let's look at the social anxiety spectrum, because rejection sensitive dysphoria is part of that, as are perfectionism and imposter syndrome. We can't discuss RSD without looking at social anxiety. Humans are wired for connection, and our needs make us vulnerable. Social anxiety, RSD, perfectionism, and imposter syndrome all share a fundamental issue, that we have a core sense of deficiency, a belief that you are not enough, that you could easily fail or be excluded because of being different, or doing something wrong that you didn't know wasn't okay, but you're receiving immediate feedback that it wasn't okay. You think maybe you're neurodivergent and you don't deserve positive accolades. You've lived with years of receiving criticism and experiencing judgments for somebody, to develop this core sense of not being enough. Social anxiety is an intense fear in advance of an event or situation, which could be embarrassing, where you are experiencing some sort of embarrassment. You are worried about what other people are thinking about you. And with social anxiety, as I'll say later, you think you know what that is, even though you don't. RSD falls under the umbrella of social anxiety because it takes these worries to the next level. RSD occurs in response to real or perceived rejection or criticism. Unlike social anxiety, it isn't a formal diagnostic category. It's a syndrome that was named by Dr. William Dodson after years of observing traits and behaviors in his patients with ADHD. Perfectionism acts as an inefficient coping mechanism for managing anxiety related to disappointment, yours or someone else's, insecurity, or embarrassment. Perfection is directly related to a need for approval. Imposter syndrome reflects feelings that you're a fraud or a phony. It is related to, quite strongly to perfectionism. Since you're not perfect and you can never achieve perfection, then you must be fundamentally flawed. And you're hiding those flaws under the successes that you may have. And the fact is that for people who live with imposter syndrome, they don't believe when they receive a compliment or positive feedback that they truly deserve it. There's a kind of a question that runs through their head. Well, if that person only really knew how I am. And so sadly, no amount of success seems to lessen that wound. So these four conditions are the domain of your inner critic. It's the voice that spews negativity about simply being an outside the box thinker. And it can result in deep shame isolation, loneliness, and very low self-esteem. What is social anxiety disorder? Social anxiety disorder is a debilitating fear of judgment by others in social situations where a person could be exposed to humiliation or rejection. It is fundamentally attached to a core belief of deficiency. It lasts for about 6 months and restricts activities, interests, and relationships. Interesting, and about an estimated 9 to 10% of adolescents who do not have ADHD have a social anxiety disorder diagnosis. But Dr. Thomas Brown has found that the prevalence of social anxiety around people with ADHD, because it tends to start in adolescence, is closer to 33%. And of course, the prevalence of social anxiety is higher for females than it is for males. And these are statistics from the National Institute of Mental Health. The increased incidence of social anxiety disorder during adolescence is not really that surprising, because adolescence is a time when people are moving from a unique reliance on their family unit and are learning how to interact with peers in a way that will set them up for the rest of their life. They become more and more autonomous from their parents, emotionally, socially, sometimes physically, and reliant on their peer group. What are some common symptoms of social anxiety disorder? Having trouble making or keeping friends, feeling self-conscious around other people, and intensely worried about negative judgment. Maybe you're embarrassed to eat in front of others. Maybe you experience panic attacks when you have to give a presentation or speak in front of a class. And that could include nausea, shaking limbs, perspiration, flushing of the face. Multitasking can contribute to the overwhelm that people with social anxiety disorder can feel in public situations, and that sense of also being overextended. By the same token, many people today, because of our devices, experience FOMO during downtime. What am I missing out on? What are other people doing that I'm not included in? And this increases social anxiety. What is rejection-sensitive dysphoria? So it comes from the Greek origin dysphoria, overwhelming feeling that is too much to bear. Rejection-sensitive dysphoria is a common coexisting condition with ADHD, not a formal diagnostic category. It refers to intense feelings related to a belief that you've let people down, embarrassed yourself, failed at something, or made a serious, unfixable mistake. And as a result, people will pull back their support, their love, or respect for you. RSD can cause extreme emotional pain that plagues children, teens, and adults with ADHD, even when no actual rejection has taken place. Sensory sensitivities that go along with ADHD contribute to this. You're wired to feel things more intensely and may replay unpleasant interpersonal interactions over and over. It's linked to a sense of social insecurity. It's very tough to recover from personal criticism or rejection. And you live in a one-down position, which intensifies your RSD and exacerbates how quickly you move into a shame spiral. Rejection-sensitive dysphoria means that it's tough for you to let go of past hurts. You may hold on to unkind words or actions directed towards you for months or years. Perhaps you can't just shake something off and believe at some level that you deserve those negative comments or that taunting or teasing. You think you've fallen short, and with your exquisite sensitivity, no matter what anyone says, you just can't bounce back. It's tough to recover. Intense mood shifts and mood changes that go along with RSD come from clear triggers versus what we see in mood disorders, which have mood shifts that don't relate necessarily to triggers. They're just sort of more erratic. There's not a direct link. Next slide, please, Carly. What are some traits of RSD? So one of the reasons that I talked about anxiety when we started is because RSD can be experienced as an intense anticipatory anxiety. You expect something negative. You believe that rejection most likely will occur. You may see yourself as a failure or as a disappointment to others. Or if you let someone down, then you can't come back and be present with them because you've gone down that shame spiral slide into what a terrible person you are. You have trouble perceiving responses from others neutrally and may overreact to this perceived injury or threat. People with RSD can often be people pleasers, just like we see in perfectionists, to avoid conflict or disapproval. They strive for perfection to compensate for that deep fear of failure that they carry around that could lead to exclusion, rejection, judgments. You often live with lack of confidence in interpersonal relationships. You worry what other people are thinking about you, and you think you know what that is. Okay, that's a direct component of social anxiety that we also carry in RSD. We anticipate rejection or trouble in new situations. Next slide, please. There are two types of rejection-sensitive dysphoria: internalized, which are negative feelings and strong reactions that are directed to and stay inside of the person. They're seen in heightened anxiety or panic disorders. Externalized, which are negative feelings or strong reactions that are directed outwardly towards others. This can be seen in aggressive behavior or outbursts. This can look like bipolar disorder or borderline personality disorder, which is why seeing someone who really understands what RSD is important to separate out and rule out bipolar disorder or major depression or PTSD or borderline personality disorder. There's a lot of questions in the field about whether or not RSD is a form of post-traumatic stress disorder that's related to complex trauma. Dr. Dotson says no, but others disagree. And when we think about trauma, we want to think there are three types of trauma we really want to consider: acute or single incident trauma. So this could be a situation where you perhaps have a terrible car accident, or you're really bullied at school, and it doesn't happen again, but that one incident has changed in many ways how you live your life. There's chronic trauma, which is repeated and prolonged incidents of trauma, such as domestic violence or abuse. And then complex trauma, exposure to various and multiple traumatic events. And this is what we see is linked most often with ADHD, because there's a combination of educational trauma for many people, interpersonal trauma, racial, socioeconomic trauma, gender trauma, gender diversity, trauma-related issues, excuse me, and what we call the 1,000 little paper cuts a day of living with ADHD. RSD is the product of being criticized and judged negatively for being who you are and being made to feel not enough or bad because you're too much, or you're distracted and you're not present, or for some reason you fall short more than other people. The result of the trauma of being neurodivergent in a world designed for neurotypical brains cannot be underestimated for people who live with ADHD. This is why emotional dysregulation has come to the forefront lately in terms of key symptoms of ADHD. If someone feels marginalized and they're being careful about avoiding rejection, is that a logical response to the fear of being othered or excluded? Or is it something that makes them wrong, that they're not okay, that we have to label it as a problem? This is a question I'd like to ask you because I'm not sure about the answer. Slide, please. How do perfectionism and imposter syndrome contribute to RSD? Well, perfectionists are often driven by the fear of disappointing themselves or others. They are very much like people with ADHD, all or nothing thinkers. If it's not completely right, then it must be a failure. Perfectionists set unrealistic standards for themselves, and they constantly compare themselves to others, often negatively, in what I call the compare and despair syndrome. And thanks to these things, our phones, people are doing this all the time. You know, they see something on TikTok or on Snapchat or Facebook or YouTube. Why isn't this happening for me? Why aren't I doing this? And then they put themselves in a lesser position. Neurodivergent people frequently compare themselves unfavorably to neurotypical peers. And they can be very sensitive to criticism, perfectionists can, and easily discouraged when they can't complete goals in the way that they imagine them. And so therefore, if they're doing a task and it's not turning out the way they thought it would be, they stop. There are two types of perfectionism. Productive, or what we call adaptive perfectionism, which supports motivation. I want to do a good job. I want to get started. Productivity and persistence. And then there's toxic, or what we call maladaptive perfectionism, which perpetuates negative self-esteem, rigidity, defensiveness. Perfectionism is one way that people try to control outcomes. And that's why it's a fundamental aspect of managing anxiety. Living with ADHD means experiencing moments when you're aware that you're struggling or you might have messed up, but you don't necessarily know why or how to fix it. And over time, this develops into that core sense of deficiency, a persistent worry. When is the next time I'm going to receive negative feedback when I wasn't expecting it, because clearly I'm not okay? Imposter syndrome. People with imposter syndrome reject praise, specific positive feedback as luck. Oh, it was just luck that I did this. I didn't have any skill. It had nothing to do with my internal talent or personality traits. And they depend on others for validation and approval, just like people who are perfectionists. They take their approval cup and they're holding it out to other people to pour in some water, rather than learning how to fill that cup themselves. People with imposter syndrome will, like perfectionists, will procrastinate if they can't get something right and worry about failure. Next slide, please. Too much. So one of the most frustrating aspects, one of my clients said, of having RSD is knowing as you're freaking out that there may be no reason for freaking out, but you can't shut the feelings down anyway. And so the worst part of having RSD or social anxiety is that you know what you're doing doesn't make any sense, but you can't stop. And it can occur before an event with overthinking. It can occur during an event with distractedness, visible nervousness, not being able to actually focus on what's happening in the present, or afterwards by beating yourself up and obsessing about what you did or didn't do in a situation. What types of things do you say to yourself that reflect your rejection sensitive dysphoria or your social anxiety? Next slide, please. So this poll is a follow-up to that question. Which of the following, if any, has improved your ability to manage RSD related symptoms with ADHD? So which of the following has helped you manage your RSD? So if you could fill out that survey, that poll. Carly, can you launch that for me? I'm hoping it's launched. I'm assuming it's launched. I'll look at the survey section. Hold on. Okay, it is launched. So people are still filling that out. Great. I'm going to go on to my next slide and come back. All right, let's go back to the slides and go to the next one. So how are we going to change our relationship to our sensitivity? Well, I believe that the first thing that we need to do is change our relationship to worry, because rejection sensitivity dysphoria is not just something that happens on its own. It's related to anxiety, and it also is related to a kind of a persistent low level of dis-ease, unhappiness with yourself. Okay, so we want to change our relationship to worry by treating it like a puzzle, naming it. My worry has a name. It's perfect Poindexter, and boy, oh boy, was my worry out in bright colors yesterday when I was working on this presentation, telling me of how good it needs to be and how I have to get it right, and I finally I did what I do when this happens, and what I am going to teach you how to do, which I said, you know what? I understand that you're worried and that we feel like we can't handle it, but I've done plenty of presentations before. I've got this. Please sit down. So we expect to worry. We know that worry is going to rear its ugly head, but we have something to say back to it. Okay? Worry says blah, 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 and you can't handle it. Anxiety is an overestimation of the problem and an underestimation of the resources to deal with it. Depression is an overestimation of a problem that feels like it's wrapped you up and you can barely see out from under that wrapping. Okay. And you don't see any resources for dealing with it. So we want to work with ourselves or a coach or a therapist to create solutions to reduce the power and influence of your worry, of your perfect Poindexter, right? And that is in your courageous self. For me, sometimes people say, oh, I'm smart Steve. Stupid Steve is my worry monster, is my negative critic, and smart Steve is my inner ally. We want to identify these. I know it seems simplistic, but we have to start to build ways that we like ourselves in order to reduce RSD. So you want to brainstorm things to say when worry rears its ugly head and write those down, put them in your phone, put it on a Post-it on your computer. We want to focus on what you want. What is the goal that you want? I want to give a meaningful, helpful presentation. So I'm willing to take a risk and put myself out there, share a little of my story, give a lot of information, and see what happens. Okay? Recall a time when you were afraid of something and you met the challenge successfully. What steps did you do to cope in that situation? Perhaps there was a time where something happened and you didn't meet the challenge. What happened then? How did you recover? These are key pieces of information that you own, that are yours, to help you create a plan for moving forward and coping more effectively with RSD. These are the tools that go into your toolbox. The learning process happens over time by reminding ourselves of how we have succeeded in the past in spite of worry, fear, dread, because anxiety is very talented at erasing our memories of courage and triumph. Next slide, please. Okay, so before we get into this slide, I'd like to know if the survey is completed and we could share it, please. Is that up for me to do? Maybe that's up for me to do. Okay, here we go. So we have at 18.8%, practicing self-care. Far out. Love it. At 16%, DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, or some other therapy. And then the third option is it looks like mindful meditation. So using mindfulness. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. How are we going to reduce our emotional dysregulation? Or flip it, how are we going to improve our ability to manage our emotions? So our emotions help us build social networks. They have critical information for us. And big feelings are part of being human. The oldest emotions, fear, anger, and anxiety, developed to keep us safe by cueing us that there is something threatening in our world or social standing. So what we want to look at is the patterns that we're seeing. So we have this structure, and this was inspired by my friend and colleague, Dr. Marcy Caldwell. So you're in the flow, you're at your baseline, you're green, you're good, everything feels all right. Then you're in the blue, you feel a little disturbance, something is a little bit off. There's a feeling that isn't great, that's mildly present, but you can ignore it. Then you move into purple, level 2. The alert system is activated. The feeling of being uncomfortable is there. It's harder to ignore. It's harder to disengage. You're starting to feel overwhelmed and you're ruminating. And 3, now you're in the hot pink section. You are on high alert. There's a total focus on your feeling or the reason for it. You can't ignore it. You want it to stop. You're having physical symptoms. You are over the edge. You have fallen over the edge of the cliff. Next slide, please. There are steps for regulating emotional intensity, which are key for people who have RSD and those people who just simply struggle with emotional control. First of all, you need to identify where you are in the stages. Am I in the blue? Am I in, it's a different color here, purple, sorry about that, or hot pink. So, when we're in high alert, our body is ready to flee or fight. Our muscles are tense, our breathing gets shallow. To get more oxygen to the blood, our digestion slows down, our heart is racing. Adrenaline is running through our body. We might be perspiring. So a physical response is called for. We have to settle the body to settle the mind. So, and often at this point, we're not breathing, we're holding our breath. So you want to have a practice of knowing what calm feels like, knowing what your baseline is so that you can get back there by changing a situation or helping your body slow down with breathing tools that you use when you're not stressed, or special breathing tools that you save for when you are stressed. Alternate nostril breathing, or something I call triangle breathing. Breathe in for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 6, pause. You want to do several rounds of those. When you're activated, you want to get out of something, but you can't. And so you're starting to feel like fighting your emotions is like swimming upstream. So name your feelings and choose your self-soothers. Healthy distractions can be used here. When you're in the disturbance in the field, talk back to that negative voice and shift your focus to your experienced rational brain, your wise inner self. Close your eyes and think of somebody who loves you and what would they say to you in this moment. Next slide, please. So Dr. Dodson claims that 60% of his patients have found relief by taking guanfacine or clonidine. This shows him that RSD is neurological and not due to a lack of skills. Whether or not it's neurological, because ADHD is neurological, pills don't teach skills. They may turn down the volume and the intensity of the feelings that you're having, or they may activate you in certain areas of your brain that are slow to activate, but they're not going to teach you the tools you need. You still need to learn the tools. DBT has been shown in many studies to be an effective treatment for self-harming behaviors, including eating disorders, suicidality, emotional dysregulation. It's been very useful to slow that down, to teach self-soothing tools, and improving relationship skills. Mindfulness refers to being able to pay attention to something in the present moment without judgment or shame. You're turning your attention away from the internal noise, and you're focusing on what's happening around you in the present moment. So you're not thinking about what you think other people are thinking about you. Instead, you're staying present. Like, what are people actually saying? I'm listening, right? And this is a kind of attention training away from the internal noise. It's there, but we're not tuning into it. We're doing something else. We want to build in self-forgiveness and self-acceptance. Make that list of soothers that you can do in public or at home on your phone. Maybe a playlist of music that helps you settle. Join organizations like ADDA or CHAD or Gifted Adults. Show up here for these webinars or for our Facebook Lives. Get support. Participate in a group of people who are like you and like-minded to reduce the feeling of being alone. And finally, do more of what works. Grow your talents and what you love about yourself. Let's discuss some strategies for reducing RSD. Make a plan. You're going to get your feelings hurt. Things are going to be a struggle. What is your pre-arranged strategy? Do you need some time apart? Do you have relaxation techniques? What are healthy, soothing activities? Going for a run, listening to music, talking with a friend that will assist you, maybe journaling or coloring. Some people like to color or knit, with dealing with overwhelming solutions. Apply my STAR approach. Stop, take a pause in the action, okay? And use a self-soother. Think, decide, review. What is the next thing you could do to move forward rather than stay in this place? Act, do that thing, and then give yourself time to recover. If someone wants to give you feedback about this incident that was hard, you're not ready, you can just say no until you are ready, okay? Try to write down 1 to 3, I like 3, good enough things that happen each day before bed. This will assist you in seeing that actually things are happening that are good in your life so that you don't have to feel like there is something fundamentally wrong or missing about you. And it sort of increases your ability for positive self-talk. Quit taking things personally. I know it's easier to say than to do it, but really, we want to be able to look at the source rather than see it as all about us. My dad always used to say there are 3 sides to every story: yours, mine, and the truth. So we want to practice self-compassion. We all make mistakes, and learning from them is how we grow. When things don't go the way you hoped, take time to regroup. Talk to yourself and treat yourself the way you would approach a 3rd grader with a skinned knee instead of wagging your Poindexter finger and scolding. Practice taking a pause before responding to a question or answer by saying, that's interesting. Let me think about it. I'll get back to you. Then you can assess what's being said or talk to someone to see if you're overreacting. Develop a few self-statements of encouragement that can assist you in reducing the noise of RSD. I'm stronger than I think. My mind is uniquely wired and creative. I can make mistakes and be a good person. Next slide, please. Cognitive behavioral therapy has been found to be very useful. Another phrase that you might want to think about is, I can get hurt and bounce back. That would be a big one for RSD. So cognitive behavioral therapy with or without medication has been found to be the most effective tool for social anxiety. It helps quite a bit with RSD as well. The goal is to establish healthier alternatives to safety-seeking behaviors and to be able to be present in a situation rather than being lost in thoughts about that you've created about what other people think about you. In terms of RSD, the goal is to be able to have some perspective on the feeling that you're having, that you're not okay, that people don't really like you, they're going to reject you because you make a mistake, that you're not worthy of the relationship, of staying in the job, of participating in a situation. So we want to learn how to do that. And the positive practical perspectives is, one, you set a behavioral goal for a situation, a very small goal. I'm going to smile at new people. I'll talk to 1 or 2 people at this event. I'll focus on the conversation in the moment. And if someone turns away, I'll remember that that's more about them than about me. While afterwards, you might assess how the situation went. Were the conversations awkward, but you made it through? Was there any terrible damage that occurred? So these are things that we want to think about. Next slide, please. How do we decrease isolation and increase satisfying connections? Take a bite out of an apple. People with ADHD, RSD, and social anxiety need to feel the loving presence of caring friends and family. Surround yourself with these people and spend time with them. You don't need a whole posse. A few dependable allies works just fine, okay? So ask relevant questions when you're in a social situation. Look at people's faces. Use how, what, where, and when. Maybe greet people with a smile or a wave if you're not ready to have a conversation and you're passing them on the street or in the office. Place yourself appropriately near people and observe their volume and copy it. Pause and observe when you enter into a room before speaking. That will give you great information about where you're going to fit in and where to start. Participate with reflective statements that show you're listening. Oh, so what you're telling me is that when you turned in your research paper, you weren't sure if it was good enough. I understand that. Or something that reflects back what you hear, and be genuinely curious about others. Everybody has insecurities, whether they show them to you or not. Lay off the self-criticism and listen to what people are saying without taking it in as a direct judgment about you. Remember, we're going to try to improve our abilities to quit taking it personally. And finally, enjoy connecting with others and sharing what's special and fun about you while receiving what's interesting and compelling about them. Key takeaways about managing rejection sensitivity dysphoria. Worry tells you you can't handle a situation. Anxiety takes those worried thoughts and transforms them into beliefs about your powerlessness and insignificance. You underestimate your value, your importance to people in your life, and then you overreact due to the biology of having ADHD. Use the STAR approach to have a strategy, a plan for a couple different situations. Gain perspective and figure out your next step. Ask yourself what could go right instead of what could go wrong. Name your core insecurities, unpeel the layers of the onion and get to know them. Explore what's right about you. Counteract negative self-talk with statements of personal support. I can make a mistake and still be a good person. I am worthy of kindness, friends, and belonging. Shine a light on your accomplishments and your strengths and treat yourself with that compassion we talked about earlier. Remember that perfectionism doesn't exist. We are all perfectly imperfect. Take setbacks in stride rather than as a sign that there is something wrong with you. Shift your attention to doing what you love rather than focusing on what hasn't worked. As Teddy Roosevelt said, comparison is the thief of joy. In terms of Q-tip, remind yourself that you may receive a comment that, as a rejection, that isn't there. Someone could just be being thoughtless. Consider the source and then ask yourself if this is a source that's worth worrying about or listening to or taking in. Next slide, please. Resilience is the antidote to rejection sensitive dysphoria. It's also the antidote for shame and anxiety and low self-confidence. We want to build resilience. We want to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing, of being disappointed, of feeling unsure, believing that we can bounce back from things. Learned helplessness interferes with resilience. Resilient people ask themselves, what could I do differently? And that these skills lead to fostering a growth mindset. You understand that you get smarter and learn through hard work and trying things out. You use effective strategies. You get asked for help when you need it. You focus on things, that, your islands of competency and your character strengths. You have people who are really supportive to you, who are what we call charismatic adults. And you identify qualities about yourself that you like, and you engage in trial and error learning without putting yourself down. We want to remember that yes starts the process of change and yet keeps it going. It's 2 steps forward and sometimes 1 step back, but that is still forward movement. And this is how we're going to learn to cope and manage with rejection sensitive dysphoria. I'd like to leave you with a parting thought by Maya Angelou. You may not control all the events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them. So I'd like you to download this gift, or if you can scan this, a QR code on your screen. This is a gift for you about what I've talked about today, with specific strategies that you can hang on your refrigerator or take a photo of and put in your phone, something that you can carry around in those tough moments when you're not sure what to do. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to answering some questions at this point.
Sharon, thank you so much. That was really an incredible presentation. I know a lot of people here really felt seen and understood, maybe for the first time. So thank you so much again. We have a lot of good questions. Before we start, I want to thank Inflow once more for sponsoring today's webinar. And to think back to the survey we used at the very start, we asked whether our attendees thought that RSD should be included in the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. More than half of the people said definitely yes, and another 30% said probably yes. And I wanted to just, you know, we always get the best insights directly from our amazing readers. We had a licensed social worker write in, and she said the DSM must include the emotional aspects of this diagnosis because as a clinician, I do not have comprehensive information to address my clients, specifically adults with ADHD. And that just seems so on point. So I wanted to quickly touch on that. And I wanted to also touch on something that I've seen running through these comments today, and that is a really overwhelming sense of loneliness. And it's, I'm going to pull out 2 quotes again, because I think it's so important for everyone here listening to know that there are more than 2,000 of you on this webinar today, hundreds of comments coming in. You are not alone. We are here. You are here together. Someone wrote in to say, I always assume that I'm the problem, that I'm at fault. It never crosses my mind that anybody else could be at fault, because growing up, I was always the problem. I mean, I can barely, you know, say it without getting teared up. Like, it's really an emotional it's so important for us to recognize these emotional components of ADHD and to take them seriously. So all of that is just to say this was so important today.
Thank you, Annie. Could you put up my slide with the downloadable just so, because it went by very quickly. Thank you for a minute. I want to say to the social worker, I completely agree. There aren't enough resources for us as clinicians in terms of diagnosing adult ADHD. And for the person who's lonely, I get it. What you're saying is that you always thought that the problem was you because you got so much negative feedback that you were the problem, right? So now, as an adult, you go into situations, you expect the problem to be you. And so some of that is part of why RSD can sort of be part of what we call complex PTSD, because there is a traumatic, these traumatic events that kind of build up over time and lower a person's confidence and self-esteem. In addition, they affect how you respond in situations because you expect danger. You expect something bad is going to happen. And so that then heightens all of the anxiety responses that are related. This is why there's this, this sort of spectrum of anxiety that happens for people with ADHD. And RSD is part of that. As well as, kind of overlaps into depression, because if you're not treated for RSD, you will become depressed, and isolated.
Mm-hmm. And we know that loneliness is an epidemic in the US, but globally, the pandemic didn't help. So we have a related question I want to get to, one that I heard echoed through many comments today. They wrote in to say, when I feel rejected or slighted or hurt by someone, how can I know whether to feel these emotions is valid? Would a neurotypical person feel that they were also insulted or hurt? Sometimes I feel I'm not entitled to have strong negative emotions.
So I would say you are entitled to have your emotions however you would like to have them. I think the important thing here is that sometimes if you're having this strong reaction, to check it out with a friend or a partner or somebody who really understands you, a coach, a therapist. This thing happened and I wasn't sure if I was overreacting or not. Someone who understands the type of brain that you have, who understands neurodivergence. Because when I'm speaking as a compatriot here, when I have big feelings, I truly think that something is the matter with me. Like, what is wrong with me that I'm getting this upset? No one else seems to get upset about this. And so it's easy, I grew up, my parents called me super sensitive Sharon. My brother teased me. That was super helpful. Thank you. Being sensitive is great for being a psychologist. Not great when you're 14, but whatever. So we want to have a couple people and say, I think I was having maybe an overreaction to this. What do you think in this situation? How would you feel if someone said this to you? So we want to kind of normalize what your experience is rather than, kind of penalize ourselves for having it.
Okay, very helpful. And Sharon, you do a lot of work with teenagers and young adults. So a prominent question today was how to broach the topic of RSD to your teenager who is most likely experiencing it in a way that does not further trigger their RSD.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. So when we talk with our teens about themselves, you can very quickly get into a situation where you are telling them about them, and then they become defensive about who they are, right? So what we want to do instead is to offer them an opportunity for a conversation. I'm noticing that you're getting upset when this is occurring, right? There are triggers that are linked to RSD. That is important because mood disorders don't have those kinds of triggers. RSD has triggers. Things occur that set you off. So we want to talk about the triggers. What do they notice? How would they like to respond? How are they responding? And rather than sort of give it a name and give it a label, talk about being sensitive to X, Y, or Z. And how do we manage those sensitivities in real time with some of the tools we talked about today? The less you can label and pathologize your teenager, the better it is to have a conversation. Conversations with teens occur really well at different times in the car, when you're doing another activity like taking a walk or making brownies, or maybe in the grocery store, and remembering that, you know, when they want to talk is when we need to listen, even if it's at 10 o'clock and you really feel like all you want to do is just crawl into bed. We want to give them some time then, because that's when they're vulnerable, they're open.
Would you say that largely the same advice applies for having this conversation with your spouse? A number of people said they feel like they walk on eggshells around a spouse who does experience RSD.
You know, I think that I would say yes, although maybe not, maybe the 10 p.m., I don't know. But, you know, being able to have a similar conversation. If you have a spouse who has RSD, sometimes what we want to do is ask our spouse, you know, what is it that you're looking for from me right now? What would feel supportive to you? Because, you know, sometimes I might say something to my husband and about them having this hard time. And he's like, well, you know, if you didn't have such a busy schedule, blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking to myself, there's nothing helpful about that comment, right? What I want to hear is you're really trying to do good work in the world. And sometimes you bite off a little more than you can chew. Yes. I'm like, okay, now you see the problem. So we want to really try to reflect back what we hear, and rather than tell, use observations and statements like, I notice, I see, or I've observed.
Okay, sorry, I was muted there for a second. I am so sorry to report that we are out of time. We've gone a little over. There was so much important content to cover today. Sharon, thank you once again for this really important, insightful, and thoughtful contribution to the ADDitude community and to the lives of our readers. And also thank you to everyone who joined us today. If you had any trouble accessing the free downloadable gift from Sharon, we will follow up with that link in the email you will receive after the event. So do not fear. We will make that resource absolutely available to you. Just look for that email from ADDitude. And we hope you'll join us. We have a webinar next week on understanding depression in teenagers specifically. So for now, Sharon, thank you again. And to everyone who joined us, thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much, Annie. And thank you so much to the ADDitude team for having me as well.